Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Warren. The day I realized my wife had been manufacturing fights just to justify disappearing for days at a time was the same day I stopped trying to save our marriage and started planning my exit strategy. After 8 years of what I thought was a solid partnership, Michelle had turned our home into a battlefield where every minor disagreement became ammunition for her to storm out with her overnight bag, claiming she needed space to stay with friends who apparently never questioned why a married woman needed to sleep somewhere else multiple nights every month. Michelle and I had been married since we were both in our 20s, as young professionals who met through mutual friends and connected over our shared ambitions and similar life goals. The first few years of our marriage felt like everything I had hoped a partnership could be. We supported each other's careers, traveled together, bought our first house, and talked seriously about starting a family when we felt more financially secure. But somewhere around our 5th year of marriage, something fundamental shifted in Michelle's attitude toward our marriage, though the change was so gradual that I initially dismissed it as normal relationship evolution or stress from work. She became less physically affectionate, less interested in spending quality time together, and more likely to respond to my attempts at conversation with distracted murmurs or requests to discuss things later when she wasn't so busy with whatever was occupying her attention. The bedroom became particularly telling of how much distance had grown between us. Where we had once been intimate regularly and spontaneously, physical contact became infrequent and mechanical, something Michelle seemed to endure rather than enjoy. When I tried to address this change, she would blame work stress, hormonal fluctuations, or fatigue, always with reasonable explanations that made me feel selfish for wanting more connection with my own wife. Michelle also began avoiding the casual conversations that had once been a natural part of our daily routine. She would come home from work and immediately busy herself with work or go to bed, leaving little opportunity for the kind of easy communication that had characterized our early years together. By year 7, these changes had become impossible to ignore or rationalize as temporary stress-related issues. Michelle's emotional distance had created a permanent chill in our home that made me feel like I was living with a polite roommate rather than a loving wife. When I finally worked up the courage to address the state of our marriage directly, suggesting that we needed to have an honest conversation about what was happening between us, Michelle's response revealed just how far apart we had grown. Instead of acknowledging my concerns or expressing any willingness to work on our relationship, Michelle immediately became defensive and accusatory. She blamed me for being needy and unrealistic about what marriage looked like after several years, suggesting that my expectations about intimacy and communication were immature and unfair. The conversation quickly escalated into a fight where Michelle accused me of trying to control her and not respecting her need for independence and personal space. That argument ended with Michelle leaving the house. She didn't return that night, and when I called to check on her and ask when she planned to come home, she didn't answer my calls or respond to my text messages. Michelle came back the next morning, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. When I asked where she had been and why she hadn't answered my calls, she explained that she had stayed at her friend's house and that the evening had gotten late, so she had decided to sleep over rather than driving home. She claimed that she hadn't responded to my calls because she was still angry about our fight and needed space to process her feelings. I asked Michelle why she felt it was appropriate to disappear overnight without communicating her plans or whereabouts, pointing out that married couples should be able to discuss their problems without one person leaving the house indefinitely. Michelle responded that she was an adult who didn't need permission to spend time with friends, and that my expectation that she check in with me was evidence of the controlling behavior she had been trying to address. Rather than continuing the argument, I decided to let the issue go, hoping that Michelle's overnight absence had been an isolated incident born of emotional stress, rather than a pattern she intended to repeat. I told myself that couples sometimes handle conflict differently, and that Michelle's need for space after arguments might be something I needed to accept as part of her personality rather than something I could change through discussion or compromise. But our relationship didn't improve after that first overnight disappearance. If anything, Michelle seemed to have discovered a strategy that allowed her to avoid dealing with any conflict or tension in our marriage by simply leaving whenever things became uncomfortable. Every minor disagreement now escalated into arguments that ended with Michelle packing her bag and disappearing for the night. The pattern became so predictable that I began to suspect Michelle was deliberately picking fights in order to create justification for her overnight absences. She would find fault with things that had never bothered her before, criticize my behavior in ways that seemed designed to provoke defensive responses, and then use my reactions as evidence that our home had become an unpleasant environment she needed to escape. I told Michelle directly that I wouldn't accept a marriage where she disappeared overnight every time we had a disagreement, explaining that her behavior was destroying what little trust and intimacy remained between us. I pointed out that healthy couples work through their problems together rather than running away, and that her pattern of leaving was making it impossible for us to resolve any of the underlying issues in our relationship. Michelle's response was to accuse me of trying to trap her by preventing her from seeking support from friends when she needed it. She claimed that her overnight stays with friends were necessary for her mental health, and that my opposition to them proved that I cared more about controlling her than about her well-being. She made it clear that she intended to continue leaving whenever she felt our interactions were becoming too toxic for her to handle. Despite my objections and attempts to establish boundaries, Michelle continued her pattern of manufacturing arguments and disappearing overnight. I began to suspect that Michelle might be having an affair and using her overnight absences to spend time with another man, but I resisted going down that investigative path because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in late September. I had just finished dinner and was settling into my home office to catch up on some work when Michelle appeared in the doorway with a list of complaints about my behavior, our marriage, and various household issues that she claimed had been bothering her for weeks. Her tone was aggressive and confrontational from the beginning, as if she was deliberately trying to start a fight rather than have a productive conversation. I watched Michelle for several minutes as she cataloged my alleged failures as a husband, noting that her anger seemed performative rather than genuine. She was hitting all the usual topics that had become triggers for our arguments, but with an intensity that felt calculated rather than spontaneous. When I tried to address Michelle's concerns calmly and offer solutions to the problems she was raising, she immediately escalated her tone and accused me of dismissing her feelings. She claimed that my attempt to discuss her complaints rationally proved that I didn't take her seriously and wasn't committed to making real changes in our marriage. Within minutes, she was shouting about how miserable I made her and how she couldn't stand living in such a toxic environment. As I had come to expect, Michelle's tirade ended with her storming out of my office and up to our bedroom. I had no idea what to expect. When I finally went upstairs to check on what she was doing, I noticed that Michelle had left the house. Her travel bag was missing, along with enough clothes for an extended trip rather than a single overnight stay with friends. Michelle left the house without telling me where she was going or when she planned to return, which had become her standard practice during these dramatic exits. But unlike previous incidents, she didn't come back the next morning. Her phone went straight to voicemail when I called, and my text messages remained unread and unanswered for days. By the third day of Michelle's absence, I was genuinely worried that something terrible might have happened to her. I called her closest friends and family members to ask if they had heard from her, but their responses were strangely vague and evasive. Her mother claimed she hadn't spoken to Michelle recently. Michelle's best friend was particularly unhelpful when I called to ask if she knew where Michelle was or whether she was safe. She claimed she hadn't heard from Michelle since our last argument, but something about her tone suggested she wasn't being entirely truthful. When I pressed for more information, she became defensive and accused me of not trusting Michelle to take care of herself. By the end of the first week, I was considering filing a missing person report with the police. Michelle had never disappeared for more than a single night before, and her complete silence was unlike any of her previous departures. I called her friend again, hoping she might have heard something or be willing to provide more information about Michelle's whereabouts. This time, her response inadvertently revealed what was really happening. When I explained how worried I was about Michelle's safety and asked if she had any idea where Michelle might be, she replied that Michelle just needed a break and would probably be back soon. The casual way she said this, combined with her apparent lack of concern about Michelle's welfare, made it clear that she knew exactly where Michelle was and that there was no emergency or danger involved. Her friend's slip made me realize that Michelle's disappearance wasn't the result of being overwhelmed by our argument or needing emergency support from friends. It was a planned absence that multiple people knew about, but were deliberately concealing from me. I began to understand that Michelle had coordinated her departure with her support network, ensuring that everyone would cover for her while she did whatever she was doing. That revelation prompted me to investigate Michelle's recent activities more systematically. I logged into our joint bank account and reviewed the transactions from the past few weeks, looking for clues about what Michelle might have been planning. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions about the premeditated nature of her disappearance. The bank statements showed several unusual charges that Michelle had made in the days leading up to our fight. There was a payment for long-term airport parking and multiple large cash withdrawals. The timeline of these transactions made it clear that Michelle had been planning her getaway for at least a week before she picked the fight that gave her an excuse to leave. I reached out to her office to find out if she had taken her annual leave. Seeing the evidence of Michelle's deception laid out in black and white was both devastating and clarifying. The fight that I had thought was about our relationship issues was actually just Michelle's exit strategy for leaving town without having to explain her plans or destination. The discovery that Michelle had deliberately cut me off to conceal her secret getaway was the final confirmation I needed that our marriage was beyond saving. Someone who was capable of such elaborate deception, who could plan a vacation while pretending to work on our relationship, was not someone I could ever trust again. Michelle had been living a double life, and I had been completely naive about the extent of her dishonesty. After the initial shock and hurt of learning about Michelle's deception, I made a calm decision about how to respond to the situation. I wasn't going to wait around for Michelle to return from her secret vacation and try to explain her behavior. I wasn't going to beg for answers or demand explanations that would probably be more lies anyway. Instead, I was going to protect myself and take control of the situation while Michelle was off enjoying herself at my expense. My first step was to cancel all of our joint credit cards and remove Michelle's access to our shared financial accounts. If she wanted to take secret vacations, she could fund them with her own money rather than continuing to use our joint resources for activities I knew nothing about. I also transferred important documents and valuables to a safe deposit box that only I could access. I arranged for my paychecks to be deposited into my personal account rather than into our joint account. I removed her as a beneficiary on my life insurance and retirement accounts. Within a few days, I had systematically separated our financial lives and protected myself from any additional deception or theft. The next step was to arrange temporary housing while I decided how to proceed with the marriage. I found a furnished short-term rental apartment across town and began moving my essential belongings there, leaving behind only items that Michelle could claim were hers or that I didn't mind losing. I arranged for the utilities at our house to be transferred to Michelle's name only, since she would presumably be returning from her vacation eventually. I met with a family law attorney who specialized in divorce proceedings and began the process of ending our marriage legally. He reviewed the evidence I had gathered about Michelle's deception and confirmed that her behavior would likely work in my favor during asset division negotiations. I also threw myself into my work with renewed energy and focus, taking on additional projects and responsibilities that I had been neglecting while trying to save my failing marriage. Without the constant stress and uncertainty of Michelle's manufactured drama, I found that I could concentrate better and be more productive than I had been in months. The time apart from Michelle also gave me perspective on how much chaos and negativity she had been bringing into my life. Living in my temporary apartment, I experienced a peace and calm that I had forgotten was possible. I could come home from work without wondering what complaint or criticism would be waiting for me, and I could plan my evenings without worrying about whether Michelle would pick a fight and disappear overnight. After nearly 2 weeks of Michelle's absence, my phone started ringing with calls from her number. Apparently, she had returned from her secret vacation to find that our house was largely empty of my belongings, and that her access to our joint accounts had been terminated. I didn't answer any of her calls, having no interest in hearing whatever lies or explanations she might offer for her behavior. Michelle's voicemails progressed from confused to angry to desperate as she realized that I wasn't just temporarily upset about her disappearance, but had actually moved out and taken steps to end our marriage. She demanded that I call her back to discuss what was happening and accused me of overreacting to what she claimed was just a misunderstanding between us. Instead of engaging with Michelle directly, I instructed my attorney to serve her with divorce papers, making my intentions clear without giving her an opportunity to manipulate or guilt me into changing my mind. The legal documents would communicate everything Michelle needed to know about the status of our marriage and my plans for the future. When Michelle received the divorce papers, she began reaching out through mutual friends and family members, apparently hoping that someone could convince me to reconsider my decision. She told people that our marriage problems could be worked out if I was willing to communicate and compromise. She painted herself as the victim of my sudden and inexplicable decision to abandon our relationship. When these mutual friends contacted me on Michelle's behalf, I told them simply that I had already moved on and had no interest in maintaining any contact with Michelle beyond what was necessary for the divorce proceedings. I didn't provide details about Michelle's deception or try to defend my decisions. I just made it clear that the marriage was over and that I wouldn't be changing my mind. Michelle managed to reach me directly exactly once during the divorce process, hoping to ambush me into a conversation that I had been avoiding. When she demanded to know why I was throwing away our marriage over what she claimed was a simple misunderstanding, I gave her the only explanation she would ever receive from me. I told Michelle that she had cut me out of her life first by lying about her vacation plans and disappearing without communication. I explained that I had simply followed her lead by removing myself from a situation where I wasn't valued or respected. When she tried to argue that her behavior hadn't been that serious and that I was overreacting, I walked away without responding to her attempts at justification. The divorce proceedings took several months to complete, partly because Michelle contested many of my requests for asset division, and partly because she continued to hope that the process could be used as leverage to force me back into our marriage. But my lawyer had prepared our case well, and Michelle's documented deception worked against her during negotiations. Ultimately, our assets were divided in a way that I considered fair, though Michelle was clearly disappointed that her argument hadn't worked out as she had apparently planned. She was forced to buy out my share of our house or sell it and split the proceeds, and she received no ongoing financial support from me beyond what was required by law because she was working. After the divorce was finalized, I reflected on what I had learned about marriage, trust, and the importance of choosing partners who share my values about honesty and communication. Michelle's willingness to manufacture fights in order to justify disappearing for secret vacations had revealed a character flaw that made her fundamentally unsuitable as a life partner. I realized that I had been trying to save a marriage with someone who didn't want to be married, at least not to me. Michelle's pattern of creating chaos whenever she wanted to escape our relationship showed that she had been looking for exits rather than solutions to our problems. Her secret vacation was just the most elaborate example of behavior that had been escalating for months. The experience taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop fighting for a relationship with someone who is actively working against it. Michelle had been sabotaging our marriage for her own purposes, and my attempts to address our problems had been doomed from the start because she wasn't interested in fixing anything. Looking back, I'm grateful that Michelle's deception was eventually exposed so clearly that I couldn't rationalize or minimize it. Her secret vacation forced me to confront the reality that our marriage was built on lies and manipulation rather than love and partnership. Without that clarity, I might have continued trying to save something that was already destroyed. The months following our divorce were the most peaceful I had experienced in years. Without Michelle's manufactured drama and constant criticism, I was able to rediscover parts of my personality that had been suppressed during our marriage. I reconnected with friends I had neglected and pursued hobbies that Michelle had discouraged. The experience with Michelle taught me to trust my instincts about people's behavior and not to make excuses for actions that made me uncomfortable. When someone shows you who they are through their choices and behavior, it's important to believe them rather than hoping they will change into someone different. Most importantly, I learned that being alone is far preferable to being with someone who creates chaos and conflict as a way of avoiding real intimacy and commitment. Michelle had been using our marriage as a cover for whatever else she wanted to do with her life, and I deserved better than being someone's backup plan or convenient excuse. The secret vacation that Michelle thought would give her a break from our marriage ultimately gave me a break from her, and that turned out to be the best possible outcome for both of us. Sometimes the most destructive behaviors reveal the clearest paths forward, even when those paths lead away from what we thought we wanted.